Hi everyone, Jesse, Unnerved Gaming, back here again with another deck tech video. In this video, I am going to talk about a deck I've been playing and having a fair amount of success with. I don't have gameplay video captured yet. That will come after this. It took me a while to find this list to basically refine it to something that was working. A couple of notes quick before we jump into this list. I call it training again, but a couple of notes. Started off with this list using Ray and thought Ray would be better because of the 3 extra health and the action economy that Ray provides. But a single die Ray just has bad die. And because of it, my opponents were able to effectively mitigate Obi-Wan in such a way that I would lose significant damage output on a turn-by-turn basis. With the Padawan in play, my opponents don't want to go for Padawan, but they may. And that's okay because that is 7 damage before Obi-Wan starts even getting looked at. And with Obi-Wan's Guardian ability and proper gameplay, you can extend the life of Padawan significantly. However, one note I should make about this deck, and maybe why it can't push to the top of tournament lists, at least not in this iteration, is that once Obi-Wan goes down, Padawan is not strong enough to stand on her own 2 feet for very long. In fact, usually it's about a turn, and then Padawan is dead. So the core idea of this deck was that I would run about 50% upgrades and supports, and then the other 50% would be totally related to dice mitigation. I want to do as much dice mitigation as I possibly can in order to extend the life of my Padawan as long as possible and keep both characters in play. Because of this, what I found is as much as Obi-Wan once used the Force, or excuse me, one with the Force, when Obi-Wan would die and one with the Force would come into play from that, it just wasn't a long enough game after that for one with the Force to be impactful. And so I actually cut one with the Force from this deck, solely focused on trying to push as much damage as possible through the damage upgrades with one exception, Force Throw. I think Force Throw is still very good in this meta. It's particularly good against characters like Palpatine and against some of the consistent damage dealers like the Dooku Ventress decks. And I've played against both of those decks. And at this point, I've played over 5 games against Dooku Ventress as well as E Palpatine, and I'm 3-2 in those matchups. And in all of the matchups, my losses were very, very close. Could have gone either way. Maybe dice rolls would have changed it. Maybe they wouldn't. I'm not one to typically blame dice rolls as a factor in why I win or lose. I think that good decks overcome bad dice. So let's jump in and talk about the upgrade suite on this deck to begin with. And so we start with Force Speed as a 2 of. This is still something that I am 100% unconvinced that this deck needs. However, I might just take it down to a 1 of. I only had 1 of in real life and was playing it in real life with a 1 of and played against a eBay's Leia deck. And that deck was very fast and very strong and hit really hard. And Force Speed won me some games. And so I feel like maybe Force Speed's necessary as a 2 of, but I was only playing 1 of in real life in those games and having success still. As I mentioned before, Force Throw is almost a must-have in this deck. It does a couple of things for us that helps us. Number one, if you're up against a range deck, the one range side does indeed help trigger Force Misdirection, which is important. The Disrupt sides can really help put off decks like the big Crime Lord decks, as well as it has the ability to keep Emperor and Vader off of resources enough to affect their gameplay, where they can't isolate you, they can't feel your anger, they can't use their removal tools. Doubt is still a thing. Manipulate is still a thing in Blue Villain, but those are much less impactful than in this particular deck than Isolation or Feel Your Anger. So I love Force Throw. Obviously, the special is crazy. We all know how good the special is on Force Throw. Don't need to spend a lot of time talking about that. I've gotten a lot of flack in the forums for running handcrafted light bow. But here's a couple of things that I'll tell you about handcrafted light bow. First, The 2 range side is another enabler of force misdirection against the ranged decks. Palpatine, I'm looking at you. The 2 melee side is nothing to sneeze at because it's unmodified. So even if I roll the 2 melee side on this dice, I'm getting something for profit here. And then obviously shields and discard are nice. They're not as important. So they're the 2 sides we don't want to come up, but the special on this card is absolutely insane. The ability to deal 3 damage to a character or remove all of the shields from a character and deal 2 damage means that even if there's 1 shield, you're still dealing 3 damage. If there's 2 shields, you're dealing 4, and obviously if there's 3 shields, you're dealing 5. The flexibility that Handcrafted Lightbow brings to this deck is absolutely out of this world. Combine this with the Padawan ability, and you can play Handcrafted Lightbow on turn 1, and that's a serious threat your opponent's going to want to spend as much time trying to get rid of, and that leaves Obi-Wan's dice alone, which is something that we want here, and I'll explain that as we get into it. Jedi Robes. Now, Jedi Robes was a recent addition, and I was playing in its place before this. I was playing Force Training, and here's what I came to find out. Robes on turn 1 is great. Like, you get the 2 shields. I'm not actually playing Robes for shields. I know, gasp, holy cow, what in the world is Unnerved thinking with this? Instead, what I kept finding with this deck is the only way I was getting focus was through Obi-Wan's die. And if I get focused through Obi-Wan's die, the problem I run into is I lose damage output from Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan's one of my main damage dealers in the deck, and if I get a 2 focus on Obi-Wan, I have to pull Obi-Wan's die down in order to be able to get 3 and 2 to get to the Padawan to 5. Well, instead, like if I get Obi-Wan to roll any sort of damage at all, even if it's not the 3 side, Jedi Robes has the opportunity to roll another focus side, which means that I'm able to use that to my advantage, plus add a little tankiness, whether that's 1 shield or 2 shields. To me, this seems like a really good place to be. I don't want Robes on Padawan. Okay, I actually don't. I play Robes on Obi-Wan and only on Obi-Wan. So it's a good upgrade. It has decent dice. The modified side doesn't, on the resource side, is not something we really want in this deck, but it doesn't hurt. But the disrupt side is also really good here to go back to what I was mentioning before, where this way, if I'm showing disrupt on the robes, I can still keep my opponent off of those isolations and those use your angers, or feel your angers, excuse me. All right, I included 1 lightsaber. This is just another 3 cost upgrade, and so what I'm trying to do is increase my probability of getting a big upgrade on Padawan turn 1. However, this deck doesn't solely rely on that. There's some really good cards in the opening hands that we can talk about. We'll use the card draw simulator to discuss what you want in your opening hand and go from there. Because of the robes, I cut Makashi training down to 1. And the reason for this is because I want Makashi also on Obi-Wan. Well, why do I want that? Because there's no redeploy, number 1. So if the Padawan does go down and Obi-Wan's left alive, the plus modifier sides to this dice are incredible. Plus, it gives you another removal tool. I know people are like, well, why would you want to sacrifice 2 melee for removing a die showing melee? But let me tell you, when you've got an opponent on the other side of the board that's got a loaded up Dooku, and he's got just the ability to make Dooku into 2 melee plus the modified sides from Kylo Saber or from another Makashi training or any of those things, what I find is it's much, much simpler to just sacrifice your 2 damage to eliminate the ability for your opponent to deal any damage at all. So I love the functionality, and I think a lot of people forget that Makashi training can do this. And this is a really powerful and special way to handle it. I wouldn't recommend removing Obi-Wan's dice for melee. I would recommend removing the Padawan die if it rolls a 1 melee, even though it's unmodified, to use Makashi. It doesn't matter as long as the dice are in the pool. So then I include 1 copy of Ray's Staff because I think Ray's Staff is just a really underrated card from Awakenings. There's a couple of things that I like about this. It goes back to number 1. If it rolls special, I've got yet another removal tool. I have the ability to take away up dice from my opponent. This is incredibly powerful against Palpatine. Palpatine rolls out his range die and some other die that's not ranged, and you've got a special on Rey's staff. You're not taking any damage at all from Palpatine other than the resolve of the 2. But what I've noticed Palpatine players doing is they don't want to deal just the 2. They want to get that range die over to the 2 or 3 side and try to output 4 to 5 damage from one die. This helps that 100%. Combine this with the removal suite in the events, and I've got many different ways to manage my opponent's dice. I have Rey Staff, Makashi Training, and Force Throw in the upgrade side. Now, we're including Vibro Knife because Dooku Ventress is a very solid deck. I think it's one of the better decks in existence right now, and Ventress and Dooku cannot stop Vibro Knife. Force Illusion can't stop it. Dooku can take the shields all he wants. He can discard a card to get a shield, but he's still taking full damage. And so with this deck's damage output, Dooku can easily die in a turn or 2 when Obi-Wan is set up correctly. And also, with Padawan still around, I have done upwards of 13 damage with this deck. So it's very, very possible to push out a ton of damage, and our opponent just has to kind of sit back and look at it and go, shoot. All right, so now it binds all things. This is a slow card. There's no doubt about it. And everybody's talking about the speed of Spirit of Awakenings, Spirit of Rebellion, sorry. But I will tell you now that if you can get It Binds All Things early, this allows you to continue to play your 2-cost upgrades like by Makashi Training and your Jedi Robes, and even if you're upgrading into a Force Throw or handcrafted light bow or something of that nature, and still keep one resource available. Why is that important? There are so many reasons that's important. Almost everything in the event suite, with the exception of a few cards, costs 1 or less. So having that one resource available means that you can use them all very effectively to finish an opponent off. So let's get into that event suite. Let's talk about it. All in. Well, this deck wants to roll focuses, right? We want focuses either from the Robes, Obi-Wan, whatever it may be. And the idea is once you get a focus and you have your dice in the pool, you can use all in to fix all of your troubles and turn a blowout turn into, or make a blowout turn, all for one resource. I think any deck that's heavy focus is wanting to do this. We saw this a lot with Akbar and Luke back in the day. We're essentially doing the same thing here with Obi-Wan and Padawan. The only difference is Padawan is not Akbar. She is no slouch in dealing damage. And when you combine that with other cards like Rey's Staff and with lightsabers that can be moved to +3 sides and handcrafted light bows that can deal 3 to 5 damage a turn, you really are pushing the damage ceiling extensively. And All In says, I don't care about the mixed damage sources. Next, I'm running block. Now, why in the world am I running block? Well, I'm seeing a lot of melee. I mean, FN is a melee heavy character. So nines is going to be part of the meta, and mitigating melee dice is a huge deal. And then in addition, obviously, I think the new Vibro Vader Raider deck is going to be a very powerful deck in the meta and strong in the tournaments. And so I think the ability to be able to hit multiple melee dice is really good. And then Dooku Ventress doesn't roll big damage. Like it doesn't roll like, well, here's, threes, 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 threes. What it rolls is ones, 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 and maybe a 2. But each one of those is 4 damage. Well, a block just wipes all of that out. And if you can wipe out Dooku's and Ventress's dies, they're much likely to do so much less damage that they just can't be competitive. And that is where block is pure upside. So I play block only when I can hit 2 dice. If I have the 2 resources and I can hit 2 dice with block, then it is 100% worth the play. I play 1 copy of Caution. So I was playing a number of cards like Caution and Guard here in full play sets when I started this, and what I was finding is that I can't just repeatedly turn after turn after turn remove my own die, because I'm hampering myself for the sake of what exactly. And with the meta of Vibro Knife being a thing, the 3 shields just doesn't matter, right? So like, okay, Vibro Knife, go 3 shields on Obi-Wan, but then if my opponent resolves and I couldn't mitigate the Vibro Knife die, then I'm just basically eating whatever damage goes out, and the shields just don't matter. But I do think there are times when caution matters. For one, if I caution into Obi-Wan to give him 3 shields, that gives him effectively 14 health, which is huge, almost on the level of Palpatine size health for, and you get an extra character, so you get an extra die this way as well. And then with the Guardian ability, if my opponent rolls in, say, the +2 side, even from the Vibro Knife, I can mitigate that through Obi-Wan's guard into the shields. And that's huge because now all the rest of my opponent's damage, which isn't necessarily all that much most of the time, is got to go through shields. And that's where caution can be pure upside and pure money for us. Then finally, I go 2 deflects because I think range is still very much a thing. And this is a great card to counter Palpatine. You want to use deflects very, very vigorously to eliminate Palpatine's die because a 2 side is really 4 and a 3 side is really 5. And those are just big numbers for no pay. This is also extremely good if they're running Force Lightning or Mind Probe and they roll that big range side. So deflect is just money for that. And then I do include 1 copy of dodge. Let's say Palpatine rolls out both of his range die. I'm definitely going to be consuming dodge to get 2 dice. Same rules apply for dodge as block, where if I have the 2 resources and they roll 2 die, I'm going to spend the 2 to get 2, because this is exactly the same as if I was running electroshock and paying 1 to get 1. 2 for 2 is exactly the same resource cost. I think it's a common misconception with some players that block and dodge have to hit more than 2 dice. They have to hit like these big, big swings of dice. And they certainly can do that. And when they do it, boy, is that a tempo swing. But even playing it for the 2 for 2 is a fair trade. And in a real bind, you could still go 2 for 1 if it was absolutely necessary. Like if you were on your dying breath and if you can mitigate that 1 die, you're able to kill your opponent. Boy, that's a great reason to play dodge right there, if I would say so. Finally, I'm using 1 Force Misdirection. This is much the same reason. I feel like if I'm up against melee, Force Misdirection is very reasonably good. It's got lots of targets for it because I've got such a heavy melee presence. I don't necessarily get a ton of range in this deck, even though Light Bow and Force Throw can roll them. And so I don't look at Force Misdirection as necessarily being used to remove my opponent's range die. But I can if it comes up and if it situationally works. For 1 resource, that seems fair. I am also willing to do a 1 for 1 here. However, what I find Force Misdirect works a lot on is my opponents will have resources showing, or they'll have disrupt showing, or they'll have focuses showing. All things that I have plenty of in this deck. And boy, I can sometimes hit 2 or 3 dice that aren't showing damage that my opponent ultimately wants them to become damage at some point. And it's really good against the Crime Lord decks in that sense. Like I can go ahead and go, oh, I rolled the Disrupt side off Force Throw. My opponent rolls Disrupt on Unkar or rolls resources on Jabba or whatever it may be, focus on Jabba, and I can Force Misdirect and get rid of their dice. That's how you shut down the mill decks, is if you can get rid of their ability to choke you and get rid of their ability to use Unkar's ability, they're not getting resources and they're not really doing much of anything at that point. So I Force Misdirect is a 1 of. It may end up a 2 of at some point. However, I don't foresee that unless something drastically shifts in the meta. Finally, I'm using 2 guards. Now, this goes back to what I was talking about before, and one of the reasons why I'm not running 2 cautions. I think guard is more effective here. If the Padawan, I want to use it with Padawan's die only, so I really want Padawan to roll 1 or 2 melee side, and then I can use the guard to take away 1 or 2 dice. This seems like a good 1-for-1 exchange, especially since Padawan's 1 or 2 is typically less than the die you want to remove, because you're probably trying to remove 3s or 2s. So it's a good chance that you're exchanging less loss of damage to flip the script in terms of how much damage you're taking away from your opponent. Obviously, that's a huge thing. I'm running 2 heroisms. This is a big deal here. Heroism is one of the many ways without activating Obi-Wan you can force an opponent's die into Obi-Wan. And that's what we want to do. We want to continue to pressure Obi-Wan up and up and up while leaving the Padawan as close to full health as possible. We're just trying to buy as much time as possible. Every turn I'm going to be trying to use It Binds All Things to reduce upgrade costs and get Padawan loaded up with lightsabers and handcrafted light bows and just push out as much damage from the Padawan side while my opponent worries about the 3 melee side from Obi-Wan. Finally, I include one copy of my ally as the Force. If I have the resources for this card, then this is a blowout card. I have successfully killed a full health Ventress using this card. I had 3 damage showing from Obi-Wan plus 6 on the board. I play my ally as the Force. I blast 3 into. By the way, it was also a vibro knife. I blasted 3 into Ventress, and then I turned around and resolved the other 6 to kill Ventress, and my opponent conceded the game at that point because there was nothing on his Obi-Wan, or excuse me, his Dooku. This is a huge card for doing that. However, it's not always going to work, and that's why I don't want 2 of, because I don't want them clogging my hand. If I get it, great. It's a way for me to push through things. If I don't, I want to play the game out. The real star of this deck is honestly use the Force. Now, I know a lot of people in early, and in myself included, use the Force a lot to try to mitigate my opponent's dice. We have so many other ways to mitigate dice here that I don't think that's necessary. What I do think is necessary is making sure if Obi-Wan rolls double focuses, you can use the Force to turn one of his die to the 3 side. If this happens, Obi-Wan and Padawan, without any other upgrades on the field, can easily do 4 damage a turn, maybe even 5. Just how it kind of works out. Now, if I'm already showing a 3 and I have focus and I got Padawan at 1 damage, I may hold that 1 damage from Padawan for something like a guard to help mitigate my opponent's dice, but I can still use the Force to push up Obi-Wan into 6 damage, and that's just nothing to sneeze at. It's just not. 6 damage every turn is going to make your opponent start to squirm when it's an FN that's down to 5 health remaining, and you just watch you do 6 with no upgrades on the board. That's a huge thing. So for me, I'm looking for in my opening hand. I love having used the Force in my opening hand. I'm not going to hard mulligan for it, but I definitely hard mulligan for a upgrade to play on the Padawan, whether that be a vibro knife or whether that be a raised staff, a lightsaber, or a handcrafted light bow, and then maybe it binds all things. Okay, so let's talk about the battlefield quick. I chose Secret Facility because of the turns where I may not have all in. The ability for me to resolve up to 3 of my dice showing range or melee damage is awesome. I have a little bit of speed with 4 speed to help me get dice off the board, but if I'm sitting with my last 3 dice being ranged or melee, ideally melee, but it doesn't make any difference because it can resolve mixed damage. So if I have that 2 range sitting on a light bow, or I have the 1 range on the force throw, and I've got 2 melee dice left, I can just claim, resolve all 3 of those, and deal some damage and get the battlefield. And I'm not afraid to claim early because this deck is hyper resource efficient, even though the cost curve doesn't seem to show that. So I like being able to spend my action claiming and dealing damage and keeping control of the battlefield so that every turn I can get Padawan out first and foremost before my opponent can roll out, which gives me opportunities for things like guard and force misdirection and deflects, and you don't need it for deflect, but et cetera, et cetera. Plus, it is possible that Padawan can put enough pressure on my opponent just on their rollout that they will have to mitigate the Padawan, and that leaves Obi-Wan available. So let's talk a little bit about the cost curve. There are currently 7 0 cost cards in the deck. There are 9 1 cost cards. We have 9 2 cost cards, and we have 5 3 cost cards. Now, if I was really wanting to talk about the meta game and whether or not I thought Imperial Inspection was just going to show up all the time, which I do think it will, then I wouldn't be playing these 3s. I honestly don't think the deck needs it. I could go more 2 cost cards and continue to power out 2 cost blue upgrades or 2 cost or 1 cost blue upgrades, for example, and get things on the board for free and leave my resources available for my mitigation. So let's take a look at some card draw simulators and kind of show what we got. Okay, so we don't necessarily, I know everybody's like, oh, well, you got robes turn 1. This is really good. I wouldn't actually keep robes in this hand. I would keep the caution. I would keep the guard. I would mulligan my ally as the force and the Jedi robes, and I would keep the it binds all things. Now, tabletop Star Wars Destiny DB doesn't shuffle these cards back into the deck, so the mulligan is always a little awkward, but there we go. The next two cards that we would get in this mulligan, according to this, would be a lightsaber and a Makashi training. So what I would do in this scenario, because I've got two zero-cost events that cost me nothing to play, I would roll the Padawan out. I want the Padawan die in the pool, so I have available for either caution or guard, either one. And then I would play It Binds All Things. I would discount the lightsaber and play it for one on the Padawan, or I would play the Makashi training on Obi-Wan. Probably play the Makashi training on Obi-Wan. And then we would go into the next turn. So let's take a look at this. Now, a couple of situational cards here. Number one, am I playing an opponent that has heavy melee? If I'm playing against the Dooku Ventress deck, or if I'm playing against Vibro Vader with the Raider, then I am going to be holding the block. If not, I would mulligan it. If I'm playing against Palpatine, I'm definitely holding the deflect. Why? Because if Palpatine rolls a single range side, I can just deflect it back at him. That's a huge tempo swing for Palpatine. But then I'm also going to roll, but I want to keep one of these upgrades, and I'm probably going to keep Rey's staff in this case because it's more consistent damage output. So let's just say that my opponent's playing something that's range based, and I would ditch the block at that point. I would mulligan two cards, and I'd pick up a heroism and a dodge. So right here I have three control cards. Only one of them, actually technically four if you count the dodge, but I wouldn't be able to play dodge turn one. Plus I really want dodge for later when my opponent has big range damage output. But I'm going to go ahead and be able to use heroism. I'm going to be able to use guard. I'm going to be able to use deflect, and I'm still going to be able to play the Rey's staff, which means I can unload my entire first round hand, have good solid dice on the field, and I have lots of control options for various different scenarios that come up. All right, we're going to do one more, and then we'll cut this video short and turn it off. This is actually an okay opening hand. I like the double It Binds here because the double It Binds means that as we go forward in the future, I'm not spending resources on basically most of my upgrade suite. So I probably would keep most of this hand. I'm definitely not keeping my ally as the Force here because I'm going to be playing It Binds. And the robes are 50-50. It's nice that it's turn one, but we don't have an upgrade to put on the Padawan at this point, but we might draw into it next turn. So I would keep this. I draw one card. I get a Vibro Knife. That basically makes my decision super easy, right? So I can play It Binds and a Force Speed. So I'm going to put Force Speed on Obi-Wan, double exhaust It Binds to put robes on Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan's now got two upgrades plus a robes. I'm going to hold on to the Vibro Knife. If we roll resources, I only need one resource to play the Vibro Knife on Padawan. So this is a good example of like how we can just be really flexible in gameplay and understanding exactly how we want to manage Obi-Wan and Padawan versus our opponent. Okay, so again, goes back to the same situation we were talking about before. And in this case, because I have a lightsaber and a vibro knife, I'm going to keep this hand actually entirely. Assuming that I'm playing against range, and I want the deflect, because the guard and the heroism cost us nothing. We've talked about that. We know that the Padawan die is going to probably get consumed by guard if possible. So the first thing I'm going to do in this turn is I'm going to roll Padawan. Actually, probably, sorry, I would play lightsaber first, and then I would roll Padawan. And then if I have the guard ability available, I mean that's basically going to push me the ability to take out up to 3 of my opponent's die because the lightsaber has that +3 side, right? Or that 3 melee side. That's huge. I don't have the resources to pay the 3 melee side, so my opponent's like, "Oh, I'm not worried about that 3 melee side. I'm not going to do anything about it." But guard takes 3 of their dice. That's just monster. So I love that combination with guard and lightsaber. I also love the combination that it provides with the Padawan to go 1 or 2 dice as well. So that costs us 2, and then we would roll and play as normal just using these upgrades. We'd end up with the vibro knife being a hangover and the deflect being a hangover going into the next turn. One final hand. All right. So we got the use the force. We got the force misdirection. I like a lot of things that are going on in this hand, but we need an upgrade badly. So I'm actually going to send all 3 of those back in hopes of getting an upgrade, which we got. So I can play an It Binds. I can put the lightsaber on Padawan for 2, which would normally now be 1 discounted by It Binds. I can play the Force Speed on Obi-Wan, and we have a little less mitigation right now, which means this might be a tougher game. This is one of those hands where in gameplay could cause some problems. So I think you kind of get the idea of what I'm trying to cover with training again here. I think, I've seen decks with Rey, I've seen decks with Jedi Acolyte. I understand what all of those decks are bringing to the table. I think that Padawan enables all of the events to work better, such as, caution and guard. I mean, I know a lot of people say, oh, yeah, well, Rey will do that too, but Rey only has, on her dice, only has two sides that can enable guard. Padawan has three, so I got a 50-50 shot here of making that work. And let's not forget the Padawan could roll a focus as well, so that's not completely terrible. And then when we look at Obi-Wan, Obi-Wan's dice are like Vader in the sense that he doesn't have a ton of output because he's only got two sides that show damage. So you really have to focus his damage sides in. That's where the use the forces come into play. That's where the focus sides from robes, the focus side from Padawan, all these other things come in. So I definitely like to hear your thoughts on this deck. Please feel free to comment below. Tell me what you're thinking. If you think this is on the right track, if you think that there's some major change that absolutely would just push this deck into the upper echelons of deck performance. But my name is Unnerved, and this is Unnerved Gaming, and I hope you'll consider giving me a thumbs up if you like the video, subscribing to my channel if you like the content, and hitting the little bell icon to get notified every time I upload new content. And we'll be putting some gameplay videos up very, very soon. Thanks so much. See you soon.